Hello everyone and welcome to WhatCulture Gaming. I'm Josh and today we're going to talk about The Last of Us 2. The game has just dropped, and while we have done a review, which you should definitely check out on this channel, I did it last week, it's pretty decent if you ask me, we're going to actually do a bit of a Q&A sesh because a lot of you have been asking questions. We put it out on Twitter, put it out on YouTube to see what you guys want answered, because while the review I think goes quite in depth, it's such a big game that you just can't touch on anything. So no worries, this is not going to be full of spoilers. This is absolutely no spoilers, but just kind of trying to elaborate on some of the points that I brought up in that review and answering some of the things that you guys have asked, because, you know, there are some great questions going around and hopefully I can shine a little bit more light on them before you jump in. So without further ado, we'll get into the first question. So the first one is from Assassin Wolf 73, who asks, is the gameplay a large improvement on the first game? Particularly the melee combat, is it less button mashy, and is the exploration more freeing and interesting? Even though when you first start the gameplay itself is immediately familiar, they have pretty much just transplanted everything that made The Last of Us 1 so kind of intense and kinetic straight over. It's the same weapons, it's the same kind of button layout, it's the same gadgets, it's the same way you fight. Essentially, you're pressing square to do melee attacks, you're shooting with limited ammo. But after the first few hours, this kind of opens up much more. You have way more options at your disposal in how you get around the environment as opposed to before, because the levels themselves generally are kind of much bigger, and the refinements that Naughty Dog has brought to the table in terms of the combat and the mechanics and, you know, the systems you're engaging with, they're all much tighter. It just feels much better to engage in combat, and it helps that, you know, the combat itself is incredibly grisly and incredibly intense and quite shocking at times, actually. So yeah, I think if anything, the combat only gets better as the game goes on, and when you get more upgrades for your character, more upgrades for your weapons, and you change the way you can use them, I think the arsenal is pretty spot on. And even though it is mostly the same from what we had in The Last of Us 1, like, it's so well balanced and allows you to kind of play how you want. So yeah, in general, it's kind of more of the same, just that same framework refined a little bit more. Also, a quick thing on the exploration. Yeah, that is way more freeing and interesting, especially across the first half. Some of the areas that you're exploring are kind of huge, and every single area, even though they might look the same, you know, there are abandoned shops and abandoned buildings, things like that. They all tell a story. They all have really interesting notes and environmental storytelling for you to kind of stumble across. And the second question is from Vareem23, who asks, do the combat encounters feel unique enough for replayability, such as who you kill, how you kill them, where you shoot them? Is there enough scenarios to warrant wanting to play through the levels another time in a different way? And to this, yeah, this is kind of like links with what I said but just previously, in that you have so many options at your disposal that for most of the combat encounters, you can actually sneak through entirely undetected if you want. You can properly solid snake this stuff and just get on your belly and start crawling through the grass and sneaking around enemies. On the other hand, you can go in like guns blazing, you can set traps, you can lure enemies into an ambush and then take them all out, or you can do like a mixture of them both. So for me, I kind of worried about the combat at the beginning, like I just said, but when it got to the end, I wanted to go back through the encounters, because you could actually choose specific combat encounters from the main menu like you could in Uncharted 4, and kind of try new play styles. And I'm excited to go through it again and try to be more stealthy, because the first time around I was just killing everyone. And up next is Phantom Philly G, who asks, apparently this is one of the most accessible games ever made, with so many customizable options and how you can play, so I'm wondering what settings you played on, and if you tried out any of the features for those with disabilities. Yeah, like one of the first things the game actually hits you with before you get into the game itself is the extensive accessibility options, and these are, in a way, kind of like overwhelmingly complex. You have so many different things that you can tweak, so many different variations that you can add to the gameplay, and that's like hugely welcome. I don't need the majority of those things, but you know, if you are someone who is hard of hearing, or you know, has difficulty seeing things, or are colorblind, you know, there are so many different options to kind of jump into and kind of tweak to your own abilities. And hopefully we can throw pretty much all of these screens up right now, because there are so many different things you can alter, right down to the gameplay itself. Like, you can turn on and off modifiers for making the game easy. You can add slow-mo right from the off if you want. You can, make it so things like you always burst out of grabs if you have difficulty like mashing buttons and stuff like that. So I think it's incredibly welcome, and I think it kind of sets the bar for all games going forward. For me, I only had a cursory kind of look at these, like I said, because it doesn't really feel right for me to properly comment on their effectiveness. I just know that they're there. And in terms of difficulty, though, I played on, I think there's like 4 or maybe even 5 difficulty modes. And I played on hard, which is one below the top one, which is survivalist. And I think that's about right if you've played The Last of Us before. The balance between kind of the threatening nature of the enemies and the limited resources was about right for me, even though it does make you use listen mode. I've talked about this in podcasts before. In the first game, I never ever use listen mode, but this time around, because the areas are so big and it's sometimes difficult to see where enemies are, and that you have a scent trail as well that dogs follow, you need to use that a bit more. It's not impossible to play the game without it, but I had to actually rely on it to get through these levels this time around. Up next is Peter MJ, who asks, how does it run? Is the frame rate stable / without stutter or drops? And does it feel like the violence slips into being gratuitous? So, first of all, I was actually quite surprised at how polished this game was. I mean, that's probably no surprise because it is a Naughty Dog game. But yeah, the frame rate, even in the big action set pieces, is was for me, constantly stable. There were a few areas where it actually did drop, but those weren't in areas that you might expect. It was actually a few interiors where there's not much going on action-wise, and you're actually just walking around where it stuttered a little bit. But that was maybe 2-3 times across a 20+ hour experience. Going on to the question about violence, the violence is grim, like properly grim. There was a time where I was waiting for a guy to come through a little crack, and I was waiting for him with a shotgun, and I was waiting and waiting, and he came through, and I shot, and I blew his face clean off, and it was so visceral that I actually went, I need to have a little bit of a drink now. I go pour myself some water. I just sort of put the controller down mid-combat encounter and went. And that's not because I'm, squeamish or offended by the violence or anything, but because it is so nasty and kind of in your face. But it's not just nasty and in your face for the sake of being nasty and in your face. It ties in with the overall narrative, and I do think they get you thinking about what you're doing and who the people you are that you're actually killing in a really interesting way, and it couldn't be as effective without that element of violence. But at the same time, if you don't like that stuff, this is going to be a difficult game to get through, so I can totally understand that area as well. Up next, we have Molly Charlotte, who says, my worry when watching the trailer / early gameplay footage is the maps aren't that diverse, and my concern is that it may make the game a bit drab. Having played the game, is that a problem? Well, you know what, funnily enough, Molly, I had the exact same worry when I was playing through the first few hours of this game, because when you start it up, you are going through a lot of familiar areas, some of which look like they've been entirely ripped from the first Last of Us. You've got like libraries, you've got overrun suburbs, you've got things that are instantly familiar and recognizably Last of Us. And when I was going through and I was kind of making my mental notes, I thought that was going to be a con that I would, point out towards the end, that there wasn't much imagination. But then the game kind of starts bringing in these bolder and more imaginative environments that you're moving towards. It goes away from the familiar to places where you never expect, especially when it comes to the infected kind of nests that you run into, and the way that the cordyceps have kind of taken over the environment as much as they've taken over people. You get to some really scary and intense and kind of grotesque areas, and you get to some really imaginative stuff as well. Like Seattle as a entire city feels apocalyptic. There are storms raging in the background, and the way nature is almost fighting back against the environment makes for these imaginative and creative areas later on in the game that more than justify the fact that you start off with familiar areas and familiar locations, because what you build to is more than worth it, especially one area that I can't spoil, but it's completely different to anything we've seen before in The Last of Us' universe, and absolutely it rocks. Combined with Naughty Dog's graphics engine and this lighting kicking off and everything, it looks gorgeous, and it's something we haven't seen before. So yes, even though you might think it's familiar at first, just stick with it, because it then gets to unfamiliar territory. Up next, Aaron Coates asks, can we expect character relationships as ambiguous as Bill and Sam and Henry? I see a lot of new characters and it makes me think how they will establish and address relationships with new enemies as well as allies. So yeah, without spoiling anything, obviously, like the biggest win when it comes to The Last of Us Part 2 is the relationships between all of the characters, both heroes and villains. You know, we properly get an insight into who these people are, and like I said in the review, people aren't just entirely good or entirely evil, and you'll find yourself initially hating some characters only to find out more about them and then question what you want out of this story and question what Ellie wants out of this story, and, you know, really have to think about who these people are in the context of this post-apocalyptic universe. I'm really excited to talk more about this. I'm sure we'll have a bunch of different videos on it, but yeah, like the character relationships, while at first they seem quite straightforward and you might miss the kind of characters like Bill or Sam and Henry, as the game goes on, when you find out more about them, it just becomes far more complex. Up next, Matan Guej asks, number of hours of a casual gameplay, and what are the best, hardest achievements to get, and what is your favourite part of the game, and what about collectibles? Well, for me, the hours that I clocked in the game, I think I've had a finished play time of 22 hours and 12 minutes, and that was with me taking it slow as well. I was really taking my time to go through the areas. I didn't get all the collectibles and all of the little things you could pick up, but I got the vast majority of them, and I'm pretty sure I definitely got all the safes, and I'm pretty sure I went to pretty much a lot there, every optional area in the game as well. So it's quite a hefty game, and that's just, you know, entirely single player and well-told stories and stuff like that. So I'd say between 20-25 hours-ish if you're taking it especially slow. But like I said earlier, there's also that replayability as well. When I finished the game, I wanted to jump straight back into it, so it's not as hefty as, you know, Horizon or Days Gone, or kind of probably slightly less heftier than God of War, but it's way more focused, and it's still a big game. As for the collectibles, there is some fun stuff to find in here, and a lot of them have a story tied to them as well, and there are so many Easter eggs. Like Ellie picks up these collectible superhero cards, and you have artifacts from the old world that you find in the game as well. And a lot of these are tied to, you know, the world of The Last of Us, but a lot of these are tied to things like other PlayStation games, other Naughty Dog games and stuff like that. And there's always kind of like something interesting to find. Up next, Theo S asks, do you feel this game has a darker, more mature tone than the first iteration? And this is quite difficult because obviously the first game was dark and mature itself, and this game in parts is even darker. Like where they take the characters, Neil Druckmann has said, you know, this is a game about hatred, and you can feel that right from the opening and even right to the end. And there are some nasty, dark things that, you know, are explored here. But at the same time, it's not just unrelentingly grim. There are moments of like tenderness and genuine humanity in there. And some of my favorite moments came from kind of, you know, the emotionality of seeing these characters interact again, or interacting with new people. And while it is grim, there is that underlying theme of, you know, like hope and humanity that perhaps eventually, you know, maybe prevails, maybe it doesn't, maybe it's the cause of some people's downfall. But yeah, it's a mature game, it's like complex, but it's not grim for the sake of being grim. Up next is one of my favorite questions from Oria Gruber, who asks, can you comment please on the fan noise while playing? Yeah, I can. It's not good. It's really not good. It's not the worst I've experienced. It's not Call of Duty Modern Warfare 2019 levels, because that thing genuinely makes it feel as though my flat's about to take off and go into space. But it's not awesome. It's not as bad as I thought, but like any late period PlayStation 4 game, it's gonna cause a bit of a ruckus. I had to play a lot of it with headphones on, just because I wanted the experience anyway, but because sometimes the fan was drowning out some of the dialogue. But you know, you can whack subtitles on that bad boy, and you won't miss out too much. So yeah, the fan noise, not as good as I wanted it to be, but also not as ruinous as I expected it to be. Up next is a question from Avaliance, who says, what is the minimum number of dogs that you have to kill in a playthrough? And look, I wish I could sit here and tell you guys that you don't have to kill any pups in The Last of Us Part 2, but I know for a fact there is at least 1 or 2 dogs that have to be killed in the game. The rest you can kind of sneak away from, but I'm afraid you're going to see some dogs die, and it's going to make you very upset. Like, you thought Marley and Me was bad, you thought I Am Legend is bad. Nah, you got nothing on this. Okay, next we've got one from GamerDude 6000, who asks, will there be any jump scares? Yes, there will. It's an absolutely terrifying game, and I didn't expect that to be the case. I thought The Last of Us Part 1 was kind of frightening in parts, but this, at times, like, takes it to the next level. Some of the enemies have changed in ways that make them even more unpredictable and scarier. And you know, like, the clickers in general were always pretty terrifying in the way that Naughty Dog has elaborated on that with kind of like a more subtle soundscape, makes it really scary. The interplay between dark and light in certain areas is horrifying, and there was this one section about 2/3 of the way through the game involving the infected and turning on some power. That's very, very, very scary. Okay, now Jan Vidra asks, are they going to give a name to every single enemy in the game? And while they don't give a name to every single enemy in the game, they give a name to most of them. You know, a lot of this is kind of inconsequential, but when you are fighting these factions, you know, you'll shoot someone and you'll take them out, and someone will be like Mary or, you know, Paul or something like that. And that does manage to humanize the NPCs and the enemies in a way that's kind of, again, it adds to that questioning of video game violence and whether or not what you're doing is morally right, because these are people with names and backstories and motivations and stuff like that. So not everyone has a name, but a lot of people have a name, and when someone cries out for their friend, you feel a bit guilty at times. I mean, not always. Sometimes they are trying to put, like, you know, pull your intestines out, but you can still feel a bit bad. Will Ellie find out about Joel's actions in the first game? And I'm obviously not gonna spoil that, but I will say that the actions of the first game and what the characters do in the first game hang heavily over pretty much everything in The Last of Us Part 2. From Ellie to Joel to everyone at kind of like Jackson, who knows, who doesn't know, things like that. That all plays into the kind of central drama and how these characters perceive themselves and other people. So while I can't say whether or not Ellie does know what Joel did, what happened at the end of The Last of Us Part 1 is guaranteed to have a huge impact on this. And the way they handle it, in my opinion, strengthens the ending of the first game and actually makes it a little bit better, a little bit more complex and a little bit deeper. It's already a cracking ending, but the way they carry it on is like, it's faithful and it's good and it's impactful and it's emotional. So it's like, yeah, if you are wanting answers to that question, I guess you play the game. I don't think I've given too much away there. I think that's okay. Okay, so hopefully you guys enjoyed that and that was a little bit informative and you know more about the game before you jump into it. I had a lot of fun, you know, playing it, doing these videos, and we're going to have so much more coverage over the next week or so when all of my lovely colleagues catch up and I can finally shout at them what I've been keeping in for the past 2 weeks. But yeah, I want to know what you guys think down in the comments below. Are you enjoying the game? Have these answers cleared up any worries or queries that you had? And are you looking forward to what Naughty Dog and PlayStation do next? Either way, while you're down there, can you give us a like, share, subscribe, and head over to WhatCulture.com for more lists and news like this every single day. Even if you don't know, I've been Josh. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you soon.